Hello everyone, welcome back to IPv6 lab section. And now it's time to roll up our sleeves and witness some exciting experiment in action. So without wasting any more time, let's dive right in. This is going to be a significant lab project, and we are about to initiate the exciting process of assembling all the bits and pieces one by one. Since we are talking about networking, hence everything starts from the virtual network. And in this virtual network, initially, if you have not enabled or provisioned IPv6, your network will look like this. So let's take an example of the single VNet. Suppose you have a single VNet. In this case, I have one VNet which is provisioned for location East US, and my CIDR block is 10.5.0.0/16. I have carved one subnet, which is the default subnet, with the range of 10.5.0.0/24. I am already running a VM inside this subnet with the private IP address 10.5.0.6, and that interface will have one public IP address 20.121.59.19. And we will test our internet connectivity without having the NAT gateway or any sort of the load balancer. Let's take a look on the resources and the virtual network I talked about. So for that, I need to go to the virtual networks. Since I provisioned it, I know this range is part of the client group VNet. And that's exactly what we see here. This is having address space of 10.5.0.0/16. I should have one subnet, which is going to be the default, though you have option to change the name of the default subnet. You can make it public or private, whatever you need. This is having a IPv4 private range of 10.5.0.0/24 with the usable IP space 248. I do not see status for IPv6 since we have not enabled IPv6 so far for the subnet or the VNet. There is no security group associated, there is no route table associated. Now, if you go back to the overview, from here also you can take a look on the topology. And once this topology is populated, we can see under the default subnet, I'm running multiple VMs, and the VM I was talking about, which was the client VM, which will have one interface, and rest of two VMs, they also have some interfaces, but they are not running, or these VMs are not turned on. So now let's go to the client VM. For that, click on the virtual machines, and when you go to the client VM, we are going to see the private IP space is going to be 10.5.0.6, and this VM also has a public IP address which is 20.121.59.195. We can click on the network interface, and you can take a look on the IP configuration. This is configured as dynamic. Since everything starts from .4, we had two more resources. Those might have provisioned the first IP, two IP addresses. Hence, 4 got reserved, 5 got reserved, and the 6th one got allocated to this machine. And same time, I'm going to have the same public IP address here. What we see, 20.121.59.195. If you click on IP config, we can see how it is allocated. So the private IP address settings is dynamic in nature, though you have option to change it. And then same time we have one public IP address associated to the same interface. Let's take a look on effective routes. And I wanted to verify the default route. It should be pointed towards the internet to reach or to connect these VMs. That's exactly what we see here. I do not have any NAT gateway provisioned, otherwise I could have changed the default route towards the NAT gateway. That's exactly what I wanted to verify before enabling IPv6 for this subnet of the VM. Let's not give any discount to our verification steps, and let's verify the public IP address. So we see the public IP address which is configured here is going to be 20.121.59.195, and that is something we see from the portal. Now let's see whether is it the same IP address which is reflecting while you do the verification. So for that, let's go to the VM and launch what is my ip.com, and at this moment what I see, my public IP address is exactly the same but is reflecting on the portal, and there's no IPv6 IP address detected because we have not enabled so far. Before we configure IPv6 on our VNet level, let's try to recall the theory portion what we had discussed. So we are going to assign locally unique addresses, those are called LUA, to those VNet ranges. That's very similar to the CIDR block, though they are going to be private in nature. However, Microsoft is not going to restrict if you want to put globally unique addresses, GUA, but that doesn't make all your VMs or IPs routable over the internet. So the concept is very, very similar to the IPv4. These are the private ranges which we are going to configure on VNet level. This is how you can visualize. You have a single VNet, your v4 CIDR block is enabled. Top of that, you are going to enable v6, which is by default going to be /48 offering from the Microsoft. However, you have option to change your CIDR block as per your need. Then you're going to carve out those subnets. So by default, you will have option to go for IPv4 native, and you have option to go for dual stack where your subnet will be enabled for v4 and v6 both. Let's take a look on our existing VNet, which is client group VNet. And if I go to the subnets where we have only one subnet provision with the IPv4 native, click on that and try to add v6 address, and which is going to give you the warning that IPv6 is not enabled. However, if you want to enable it, you can go to the address space. So if I go to the address space, I can add v4 or v6 ranges from here. However, it is not suggesting you any range. That means you have option, you can build your own range, very similar to when you do the IP range or address provisioning for your sites. You will do a planning basically maybe on the Excel sheet or maybe some IPAM tool, how the ranges will look like for each site. It's a very, very similar concept here. So it is not suggesting. But let's take a look. When you create a new virtual network, and I just want to give it a name, VNet 6 or maybe VNet 7, and I go to the IP address. By default, it's giving you the IPv4 address space only. And now when you click here, add IPv6 address range, and it is suggesting you this is a range. And again, take a look on the first bits. It's FD00. That means it's a private space being allocated to you. And by default, it's going to give you the /48. You can copy it from here, which I'm going to do it. You have an option to change those CIDR block ranges as well. And once you add v6, you will be able to allocate /64 from this range to your subnet. So I will use this one, which is /48, and I will go to the virtual network, the previous one, and on the address space, I'm going to put this as it is /48, and let's try to save it. Now my range are saved. That means if I go to the overview and if I go to basically the address space
From here, we see it. There was one more field where we could have seen. Anyways, let's go to the subnets. And now, what we want to do? We want to basically add IPv4 v6 range. And now it's not giving you any sort of the warning, but it is giving you a example that the range which you're going to add, you need to add /64, and here this /64 is not editable. That means it has to be /64. So what I will do, I will go to my IPv6 calculator and I put this range here, which is /48, and now I need /64 subnets. So my first subnet, let's try to use this subnet here. And I'll go back. I'm going to use this one. I don't have any NAT gateway, security group, routing. So let's try to save it. This has been saved. And now we see it is telling you this is your v6 range for this subnet. There's a small catch here. The catch is when you allocate v6 range on the interface, it is going to be 101 relationship. I do have a bigger range. /64 is going to give you a lot of IP addresses, but this range is limited. So that is something you need to keep in mind. And we are going to discuss more in detail what are the implication of having those 101 relationship. There's a small catch and limitation with the v6, especially on Azure. So IPv6 only virtual machines or virtual machine skill sets are not supported. Each NIC must include at least one IP address, which is going to be IPv4 primary, and top of that you can configure the IPv6. So I was talking about the implication of having two different ranges. So for example, we always had /24, though we have a big range here. And since it is going to be kind of 101 relation, you must have the IPv4 address allocated to NIC before you assign v6. So it might happen you have these v4 ranges exhausted, though you have a lot of IPv6 IP addresses pending for use. So you need to plan your ranges carefully to basically extract all the use of IPv6 and v4 dual stack deployment.
Now let's take a look how to assign IPv6 address on virtual machine. So let's click on the virtual machine. I was working on that. Go to the networking section. Under the networking section, choose your network interface card. Go to the IP configuration. And in IP configuration, we can see there's a name ipconfig1. IP version is IPv4 and type is primary, and the IP assignment is 10.5.0.6, which is dynamically assigned. On top of that, I have an instance level public IP address, which is 20.121.59.195. Now let's do an assignment of v6. So I'm going to put v6. Type is going to be IPv6. You have an option. You can go for the dynamic. You can go for the static. If you go for the static, you need to choose an IP address from the range. I will go for the dynamic at this moment and click add. This is one note which is coming. A primary IP configuration already exists. Any additional IP is going to be secondary. So let's wait until this get completed and we'll verify that.
updated network interface, and now we can see there's a name which we have given IPv6. Type is v6, and the type is going to be basically secondary, and IPv version is going to be v6. And this is the IP address which got assigned. And we see it is very, very similar to the v4. The first IP address is start from .4, and it is dynamically assigned. Now, that means IPv6 is configured, though this range is going to be the private. So if you have other VMs running and you assign very similar way the private IP space, these VMs can talk to on v6. You can check the connectivity. However, in this lab, we wanted to test the internet connectivity. That means I should have a public IP address on instance level, or I should have the load balancer. So in this lab, basically we are going to do instance level public IP address, which comes from v6. So let's create a v6 address, and I want to give it a name. This should be okay. v6 is going to be standard, regional, and now let's create it. Initializing deployment. So at this moment, it's just creating a v6 public IP address, which we are going to attach it to interface. Deployment is in progress. Public IP address status created. Now my deployment is ready. I can go to the resource just to verify. So this IP address is basically a public IP address which comes automatically from the Azure range. Now, since we have the IP address, now let's go back to our machine, go to the interface, IP configuration. Now click on v6. And now what do we want to do? Basically want to attach one public IP address what we created. And its name is IPv6 client. And now let's save it. A small difference here, what you can observe. So basically in Azure, you can say you have a private IP address assigned to the interface, and then you might have the NAT gateway where all the NAT takes place. In this case, we are doing instance level IP address. That means there's not going to be any load balancer, etc., which is going to do some sort of the translation. So now we have a public IP address assigned to this machine, and at this moment, we should be able to do a communication on IPv4 and v6. So let's do our testing. I'm logged into this VM, and from here, if I do what is my IP address.com, it is detecting my IPv4 address, which is 20.121.59.195. However, it is not detecting IPv6. Initially, I suspected I might have something wrong with my deployment, but that is not the case. There seems to be a problem with this website, so I checked on another website, which is test-ipv6.com, and it is giving me the proper result. So it is detecting my public IP address, which is from v4. It is also detecting my v6 address, and you can go for other test scenarios what is performed in the background. So it clearly mentions I do have IPv4 and v6 connectivity as appropriate. And now what I wanted to do here, basically do some more testing before we declare that IPv6 is working as expected. So I will go to the command prompt, and from command prompt you can you can pick any of the public IP address from v6 range and do a ping, and I see I'm getting a response which comes as a reply from these IP addresses. That means my IPv6 deployment is working as expected. The final validation we are going to do while checking the effective routes. So click on the effective routes and wait to this routing table to get populated. Now we see for V4 I had this default route, and now for V6 we are also going to see this default route towards the internet. That was the final validation. In the next scenario, we will create a load balancer and put these VMs behind the load balancer to test the V6 connectivity. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next section.